Animals in space originally only served to test the survivability of spaceflight, before manned space missions were attempted. Later, animals were also flown to investigate various biological processes and the effects microgravity and spaceflight might have on them. To date, 7 national space programs have flown animals into space: the Soviet Union, the United States, France, Argentina, China, Japan and Iran. Background: animals had been used in aeronautic exploration since 1783 when the Montgolfier brothers sent a sheep, a duck and a rooster aloft in a hot air balloon. The limited supply of captured German V-2 rockets led to the U.S. use of high-altitude balloon launches carrying fruit flies, mice, hamsters, guinea pigs, cats, dogs, frogs, goldfish and monkeys to heights of up to 144,000 feet. These high-altitude balloon flights from 1947 to 1960 tested radiation exposure, physiological response, life support and recovery systems. The U.S. high-altitude manned balloon flights occurred in the same time frame, one of which also carried fruit flies. The first animals sent into space were fruit flies aboard a U.S.-launched V-2 rocket on February 20, 1947 from White Sands Missile Range, New Mexico. The purpose of the experiment was to explore the effects of radiation exposure at high altitudes. The rocket reached 68 miles in 3 minutes and 10 seconds, passed both the U.S. Air Force 50-mile and the International 100 km definitions of the boundary of space. The Blossom capsule was ejected and successfully deployed its parachute. The fruit flies were recovered alive. Other V-2 missions carried biological samples, including moss. Albert II, a rhesus monkey, became the first monkey in space on June 14, 1949, in a U.S.-launched V-2, after the failure of the original Albert's mission on ascent. Albert I reached only 39 miles altitude. Albert II reached about 83 miles. Albert II died on impact after a parachute failure. Numerous monkeys of several species were flown by the U.S. in the 1950s and 1960s. Monkeys were implanted with sensors to measure vital signs, and many were under anesthesia during launch. The death rate among monkeys at this stage was very high. About 2/3 of monkeys launched in 1940s and 1950s died on missions or soon after landing. 1950s. On August 31, 1950, the U.S. launched a mouse into space aboard a V-2, but the rocket disintegrated because the parachute system failed. The U.S. launched several other mice in the 1950s. On July 22, 1951, the Soviet Union launched the A-1 flight, carrying the dogs Tsigan and Desik into space, but not into orbit. These 2 dogs were the first living higher organisms successfully recovered from a space flight. Both space dogs survived the flight, although one would die on a subsequent flight. The U.S. launched mice aboard spacecraft later that year. However, they failed to reach the altitude for true spaceflight. On November 3, 1957, the second-ever orbiting spacecraft carried the first animal into orbit, the dog Laika, launched aboard the Soviet Sputnik 2 spacecraft. Laika died during the flight, as was intended because the technology to return from orbit had not yet been developed. At least 10 other dogs were launched into orbit and numerous others on suborbital flights before the historic date of April 12, 1961, when Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. On December 13, 1958, a Jupiter IRBM, AM-13, was launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida, with a United States Navy-trained South American squirrel monkey named Gordo on board. The nose cone recovery parachute failed to operate and Gordo was lost. Telemetry data sent back during the flight showed that the monkey survived the 10 g of launch, 8 minutes of weightlessness and 40 g of re-entry at 10,000 miles per hour. The nose cone sank 1,302 nautical miles downrange from Cape Canaveral and was not recovered. Monkeys Abel and Baker became the first monkeys to survive spaceflight after their 1959 flight. On May 28, 1959, aboard Jupiter IRBM AM-18, were a 7-pound American-born rhesus monkey, Abel, and an 11-ounce squirrel monkey from Peru, Baker. The monkeys rode in the nose cone of the missile to an altitude of 360 miles and a distance of 1,700 miles down the Atlantic missile range from Cape Canaveral, Florida. They withstood forces 38 times the normal pull of gravity and were weightless for about 9 minutes. A top speed of 10,000 miles per hour was reached during their 16-minute flight. The monkeys survived the flight in good condition. Abel died 4 days after the flight from a reaction to anesthesia, while undergoing surgery to remove an infected medical electrode. Baker was the center of media attention for the next several months as she was watched closely for any ill effects from her space flight. She was even mated in an attempt to test her reproductive system. Baker lived until November 29, 1984, at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. On July 2, 1959, a launch of a Soviet Tu rocket, which reached 212 kilometers, carried 2 space dogs and Marfusa, the first rabbit to go into space. A September 19, 1959 launch, Jupiter AM-23, carried 2 frogs along with 12 mice, but the rocket was destroyed during launch. 1960s. On August 19, 1960, Russia launched Sputnik 5, which carried the dogs Belka and Strelka, along with a gray rabbit, 40 mice, 2 rats, and 15 flasks of fruit flies and plants. It was the first spacecraft to carry animals into orbit and return them alive. One of Strelka's pups, Pashinka, bred and born after her mission, was given as a present to Caroline Kennedy by Nikita Khrushchev in 1961, and many descendants are known to exist. The USA sent 3 black mice, Sally, Amy and Mo, 1,000 kilometers up and 8,000 kilometers distance from Cape Canaveral on October 13, 1960, using an Atlas D-71D launch vehicle. The mice were retrieved from the nosocom near Ascension Island and were said to be in good condition. On January 31, 1961, Ham the chimp was launched in a Mercury capsule aboard a Redstone rocket. His mission was Mercury Redstone 2. The chimp had been trained to pull levers to receive rewards of banana pellets and avoid electric shocks. His flight demonstrated the ability to perform tasks during spaceflight. A little over 3 months later, the United States sent Alan Shepard into space. Enos the chimp became the first chimpanzee in orbit on November 29, 1961, in another Mercury capsule, an Atlas rocket, Mercury Atlas V. On March 9, 1961, the Soviet Union launched the Korabl Sputnik 4 that carried a dog named Chernushka, some mice, frogs and, for the first time into space, a guinea pig. All were successfully recovered. France flew their first rat into space on February 22, 1961. 2 more rats were flown in October 1962. On October 18, 1963, France launched FAR copyright Lysette the cat aboard Veronique AGI-sounding rocket No. 47. The launch was directed by the French Centre d'Enseignement et de Recherche de Mar copyright Dessin or copyright Ronaldique. FAR copyright Lysette was recovered alive after a 15-minute flight and a descent by parachute. FAR copyright Lysette had electrodes implanted into her brain, and the recorded neural impulses were transmitted back to Earth. A second cat was sent to space by CERMA on October 24, 1963. There was a delay in recovery of the capsule, and this cat was found dead when finally recovered. The final French animal launches were of 2 monkeys in March 1967. China launched mice and rats in 1964 and 1965, and 2 dogs in 1966. During the Voskhod program, 2 Russian space dogs, Vitrok and Ugoliok, were launched on February 22, 1966, on board Cosmos 110 and spent 22 days in orbit before landing on March 16. This spaceflight of record-breaking duration was not surpassed by humans until Soyuz 11 in 1971 and still stands as the longest spaceflight by dogs. The United States launched Biosatellite I in 1966 and Biosatellite I-2 in 1967 with fruit flies, parasitic wasps, flower beetles and frog eggs, along with bacteria, amoebae, plants and fungi. On April 11, 1967, Argentina also launched the rat Belisario, atop a Urara rocket, from Córdoba military range, which was recovered successfully. This flight was followed by a series of subsequent flights using rats. It is unclear if any Argentinian biological flights passed the 100 km limit of space. The first tortoise in space was launched September 14, 1968 by the Soviet Union. The Hossfield's tortoise was sent on a circumlunar voyage along with wine flies, mealworms and other biological specimens. These were the first animals in deep space. The capsule was recovered at sea on September 21. The United States launched the monkey Bonnie, a macaque, in 1969 on the first multi-day primate mission. It was one of 4 U.S. monkey missions in the 1960s. In total in the 1950s and 1960s, the Soviet Union launched missions with passenger slots for at least 57 dogs. The actual number of dogs in space is smaller, because some dogs flew more than once. On December 23, 1969, as part of the Operación Cube de Navidad, Argentina launched Juan using the Canopus 2 rocket. It ascended 82 kilometers and then was recovered successfully. Later, on February 1, 1970, the experience was repeated with a female monkey of the same species using the X-1 Panther rocket. It reached a higher altitude than its predecessor, but it was lost after the capsule's parachute failed. 1970s. 2 bullfrogs were launched on a one-way mission on the orbiting Frog-Otolith satellite on November 9, 1970, to understand more about space motion sickness. Apollo 16 on April 16, 1972 carried nematodes, and Apollo 17, launched on December 7, 1972 carried 5 pocket mice, although one died on the circumlunar trip. Skylab 3 carried pocket mice and the first fish in space, and the first spiders in space. Microgravity were also flown by the U.S. on the Apollo-Soyuz joint mission, launched July 15, 1975. The Soviets flew several Bion program missions which consisted of satellites with biological cargoes. On these launches they flew tortoises, rats, and microgravity. On Soyuz 20, launched November 17, 1975, tortoises set the duration record for an animal in space when they spent 90.5 days in space. Salyut 5 on June 22, 1976, carried tortoises and a fish. 1980s, the Soviet Union sent 8 monkeys into space in the 1980s on Bion flights. In 1985, the U.S. sent 2 squirrel monkeys aboard Spacelab 3 on the Space Shuttle with 24 male albino rats and stick insect eggs. Bion flights also flew zebra danio, fruit flies, rats, stick insect eggs and the first newts in space. Bion 7 had 10 newts on board. The newts had part of their front limbs amputated, to study the rate of regeneration in space, knowledge to understand human recovery from space injuries. After an experiment was lost in the Challenger disaster, chicken embryos were sent into space in an experiment on STS-29 in 1989. The experiment was designed for a student contest. 1990s, 4 monkeys flew aboard the last Bion flights of the Soviet Union as well as frogs and fruit flies. The Photon program flights carried dormant brine shrimp, newts, fruit flies, and sand desert beetles. China launched guinea pigs in 1990. Toyohiro Akiyama, a Japanese journalist, carried Japanese tree frogs with him during his trip to the Mir space station in December 1990. Other biological experiments aboard Mir involved quail eggs. Japan launched its first animals, a species of newt, into space on March 18, 1995 aboard the Space Flyer unit. During the 1990s the U.S. carried crickets, mice, rats, frogs, newts, fruit flies, snails, carp, medakar, oyster toadfish, sea urchins, swordtail fish, gypsy moth eggs, stick insect eggs, brine shrimp, quail eggs, and jellyfish aboard space shuttles. 2000s, the last flight of Columbia in 2003 carried silkworms, garden orb spiders, carpenter bees, harvester ants, and Japanese killifish. Nematodes from one experiment were found still alive in the debris after the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. C. elegans are also part of experiments aboard the International Space Station as well as research using quail eggs. Earlier shuttle missions included grade school, junior high and high school projects. Some of these included ants, stick insect eggs and brine shrimp cysts. Other science missions included gypsy moth eggs. On July 12, 2006, Bigelow Aerospace launched their Genesis I inflatable space module, containing many small items such as toys and simple experiments chosen by company employees that would be observed via camera. These items included insects, perhaps making it the first private flight to launch animals into space. Included were Madagascar hissing cockroaches and Mexican jumping beans, seeds containing live larvae of the moth Cydia. On June 28, 2007, Bigelow launched Genesis II, a near-twin to Genesis I. This spacecraft also carried the Madagascar hissing cockroaches and added South African flat rock scorpions and seed harvester ants. In September 2007, during the European Space Agency's PHOTON-M3 mission, tardigrades, also known as water bears, were able to survive 10 days of exposure to open space with only their natural protection. On the same mission, Nadezhda, a common Russian cockroach, was sent into space inside a sealed container, and became the first Earth creature to give birth outside the Earth, giving birth to 33 creatures on board. In November 2009, STS-129 took painted lady and monarch butterfly larvae into space for a school experiment as well as thousands of C. elegans roundworms for long-term weight loss studies. 2010s, on February 3, 2010, on the 31st anniversary of its revolution, Iran became the latest country to launch animals into space. The animals were launched on top of the Kavashgar 3 rocket and returned alive to Earth. In May 2011, the last flight of Endeavour carried 2 golden orb spiders, named Gladys and Esmeralda, as well as a fruit fly colony as their food source in order to study the effects of microgravity on spiders' behavior. In November 2011, the Living Interplanetary Flight experiment on the Phobos Grunt mission planned to carry tardigrades to Mars and back. However, the mission failed to leave Earth orbit. In October 2012, 32 Medakar fish were delivered to the International Space Station by Soyuz TMA-06M for the new aquatic habitat in the Kibo module. On January 28, 2013, Iranian news agencies reported that Iran sent a monkey in a Pishgam rocket to a height of 72 miles and retrieved a shipment. Later, Iran's space research website uploaded an 18-minute video. The video was uploaded later on YouTube. In January 2014, the search strategies of pavement ants were studied on the ISS. On July 19, 2014, Russia announced that they launched their Photon-M4 satellite into low Earth orbit with 1 male and 4 female geckos as the payload. This was an effort to study the effects of microgravity on reproductive habits of reptiles. On July 24, 2014, it was announced that Russia had lost control of the Photon-M4 satellite, leaving only 2 months to restore contact before the gecko's food supply was exhausted. Control of the satellite was subsequently restored on July 28, 2014. On September 1, 2014, Russia confirmed the death of all 5 geckos, stating that their mummified bodies seemed to indicate they froze to death. Russia is said to have appointed an emergency commission to investigate the animals' deaths. On September 23, 2014, the SpaceX CRS-4 mission delivered 20 mice to live on the ISS for study of the long-term effects of microgravity on the rodents. On April 14, 2015, the SpaceX CRS-6 delivered 20 C-57BL/6 and TAC mice to live on the ISS for evaluate microgravity as the extreme opposite of a healthy active lifestyle. In the absence of gravity, astronauts are subject to a decrease in muscle, bone, and tendon mass. Although, we unregistered trademark Re not out to treat couch potatoes, states head Novartis Institute for Biomedical Research scientist on the project Dr. Sam Cadena, we unregistered trademark Re hoping that these experiments will help us to better understand muscle loss in populations where physical activity in any form is not an option. For example, In the frail elderly or those subjected to bed rest or immobilization due to surgery or chronic disease. Criticism: sending animals into space is strongly criticized by animal rights organizations. See also: Bioastronautics, model organism, Soviet space dogs, monkeys and apes in space, organisms at high altitude, timeline of solar system exploration, plants in space. References. Further reading: McDowell, Jonathan. The History of Spaceflight, Non-Human Astronauts. The History of Spaceflight. Archived from the original on February 2, 2008. Retrieved January 31, 2008. L. W. Fraser and E. H. Siegler, High-Altitude Research Using the V-2 Rocket, March 1946 April 1947, pages 90. Kenneth W. Gatland, Development of the Guided Missile, pages 188, Captain David G. Simons, Use of V-2 Rocket to Convey Primate to Upper Atmosphere, pages 1. Lloyd Mallon, Men, Rockets, and Space Rats, pages 84–93. Henry, James P. Al. Animal Studies of the Subgravity State During Rocket Flight. Journal of Aviation Medicine 23, 421–432. PMID 12,990,569. External links: History of chimpanzees in U.S. air and space research, History of research in space biology and biodynamics, One Small Step, The Story of the Space Chimps. Documentary on history of primates used in space travel, Felicet and Felix, Space Cats.